For the camera, yeah, continue. But for the camera, this is July 19, 2012. I'm Walker Todd, the director of the AIER Summer Fellowship Program, and we're pleased to have with us today as a guest speaker David Colander, professor of economics at Middlebury College in Vermont. I know that he has his PhD from Columbia, but where did you grow up?
I never grew up.
You never grew up, yeah.
Jamestown, New York.
Jamestown, New York, right, out near where I hang out. That's a Chautauqua Cap over there. And where did you go to undergrad?
Columbia.
At Columbia College also. So with that, I will give you David talking about economists, why they should think of themselves as engineers, not scientists. Okay. Go ahead and continue.
Again, before I get into my talk, I want to continue sort of just the discussion because it ties into the talk that we're doing. And, you know, sort of, I work with these people, and it's cointegrated vector autoregression. It's tough stuff. I mean, you know, that really goes there. I can't follow it. I'm more a methodologist trying to understand it. But there's a lot of people who do it. It's not heard of here in the US. I mean, it just isn't taught at any place whatsoever. Why? Well, David Hendry. Have any of you heard of David Hendry? Who's an extraordinarily bright British one. He's also difficult to a difficult personality. And believe me, personalities play a big role in, you know, sort of how things work and sort of operate there. So if you're thinking sort of approaches of how to sort of take it, look where you find a difficult personality. Say, do they have some interesting things? There's also a lot of statisticians who work on it. But you have vector autoregression, you just dump it in, and here you get some results. You print up the stuff. Printing up, looking at just what you get is a good way of figuring out, you know, sort of how things are sort of related. Now, it doesn't give you any sense of precision at all. Nor does it tell you if there's structural changes moving on in the data. So that's why they moved to cointegrated vector autoregression. So cointegration, what it tries to do is find structure. Where are structural paths that we can find that hold? There's no theory whatsoever in this. This is straight statistics, trying to say what can the data tell us. Now, in order to interpret what the data is telling us, what you need to do is, you know, sort of decide what the data are telling you, is you have to have certain conceptions. That's theory. So your theory is absolutely necessary. The data tell you nothing without theory. But the question is, do you do theory first and then test it in some sense? And that's sort of the sense that you're taught, econometrics. You do this theory, so if you've done first year, you had macro theory, micro theory, it was all theory. Oh, we're going to test it later on. Well, you know, testing it is there. And then you have econometrics. Well, these are the tools that you're going to use to test it. This other way is you look at the economy. You look at what's going on, and looking at the economy means, number one, looking at the institutions. Looking at what happens, following what's going on. A lot of the people here at the Institute sort of use that approach. Too little used by economists, you know, to have a case study to understand what's going on. The other way is to look at the data and really be a person who can pull information from data. And that's what the cointegrated vector autoregression groups are. And now what they're doing is sort of subdividing the cointegrated because you get lots of, you know, amounts. It's, you know, enormous amount of work. What amazes me is none of that is known here in the US at all. Even though a lot of it's going on, you know, over in Europe and in statistics and that. How insulated the economics profession can be because it has a particular specific methodology that it sort of has accepted for a long time that what we do is theory. And here we have this theory, and you've got to know this theory and have the theory perfect. So a lot of what you learn in that first year is how to make sure you have that deductive theory down perfectly. Once you have that deductive theory down perfectly, then you take the data, and you test the data according to a whole variety of test statistics that you're learning. How to go about testing this. The problem, of course, comes is almost never does your data series, that you have match precisely what you need for the good tests. The question is, how do you do that messy, dirty work? They don't talk about it in graduate school. And that leads to lots of problems. So the reason I got interested in cointegrated vector autoregression is I was talking to some people. They saw some of my work and invited me over. And then, we're talking about it. I said, here is a piece that's been done by a top economist. It was called Taking the Model to the Data. It was on the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model that Peter England was taking to the data. And here it was saying, I'm saying here, they're taking this model to the data and testing it to see if it's right. And I was working then on macro and the DSGE model. And I said, here, really look at these tests. Have they tested it? Have they done anything? Essentially, the result was that person would not pass the first year, qualifying exams in any statistics course whatsoever. Yet it was quite acceptably published in most places. In a whole variety of that was the way that it's done. So when you ask yourself, here are these tests, they're very, very impressive. I think what you have to ask yourself is, what are they really telling? Because if you make all these here we assume, no, it's not quite a normal distribution, but we'll assume it's a normal distribution because our testing procedures require that it to be a normal distribution. The financial, whole debacle that we had there, everyone knew that, these tests didn't fit. It wasn't that, it was unknown. But here, in order to have something, you'll have it. So that leads in to my talk today, which is that within economics, there's a methodology that's developed. And it really is a scientific methodology. Within a scientific methodology, you need things that are, here, truth, right. You need really, really careful testing of everything to decide whether it's correct or not, because a scientist is out to find out the truth. And to do that, you have extraordinarily difficult high levels of requirements. The tests you're learning are all the tests that a scientist would use. And within science, you can follow it. So how many of you in micro, how many in macro or more? Or some of you are
mostly first year.
So you haven't really picked yet. Mm-hmm. But what you'll find is within micro has fundamentally changed from what it used to be. Microeconomics used to be a deductive science. The first year is still taught a lot as a deductive science. How many are using MassQL? Okay, the ones in grad school are, that's what you'll learn. And you'll learn here, a whole variety of models, deductive, really get it right. As soon as you move to the field courses, guess what's going to happen? Microeconomics is going to become an econometric science. What you're going to be doing is econometrics. What you're going to be talking about is econometrics. You're going to be talking about double-blind field tests. You're going to be talking about a whole variety of things because that's the language of microeconomics today. It is not here this, there's some few theorists, but theorists are out now in micro. The people who are in are the econometricians, who really, know and operate doing it. But in the background of what's there, you still have this sense that this is a science testing what's going on. What I want to argue today is there's a different approach that's out there. What I call an engineering approach and an engineering methodology. Engineers do not care about the truth. I'll repeat that. Engineers do not care about the truth. It's way, way too deep and abstract for them. Who knows what the hell the truth is? Engineers care about solving problems. what works to solve a particular problem. They then choose the method that has worked in the past to solve the problems that are there. Not believing that this method is in some sense the method. It's a heuristic. It's a method that worked. It's good enough. It seemed to work in the past. If you give another method, I'll take a look at another method and see if it works better. And work with that. That's an engineering approach and view. That was very much part of economic thinking up until really the 1930s. Most economists,
Sorry,
way too loud.
Yeah.
Most economists were essentially, thought of themselves as engineers when they were doing policy, and I'll talk more about that. That changed, sort of as we moved to starting to think of economics as a science. Now, it always had been a science they talked about, but science has so many different meanings and so many different elements. So there was a movement within sort of methodology that sort of said, here what we want is to divide up economics into positive economics and, what's the other part? Normative economics, which has sort of developed in the field. That division really happened in the 50s as econometrics came. That's when it sort of caught on. It existed earlier in other fields. But, sort of in economics, it was really in the 1950s with Milton Friedman's article on an essay on positive economics and Lipsy's work on, and the thought was, here we now have econometrics that will allow us to test the theory. So we'll know whether the theory is right or not. So we have positive economics. What's normative economics? What should be? Okay, so here are our goals. So normative economics was a study of the goals. That distinction between positive economics and normative economics goes way back to John Neville Keynes, John Maynard Keynes' father, who wrote an essay on the scope and method of economics in 1896. And in that essay, he said there's positive economics, there's normative economics, and there's a third branch of economics. And that third branch was a very important branch. Anybody know what that third branch was? Something he called the art of economics. And when Friedman sort of wrote his essay, he said, I'm getting this from John Neville Keynes. And he quoted him. There's the three branches. Then he wrote the whole article as if there were only two branches. So I wrote Milton back when he was alive, and he wrote back and said, yeah, I probably should have talked a little bit more about it. The thing, what would the art of economics be if we have, here's the theory, and here is, sort of the goals. What would the art of economics be?
Bringing those together.
Yeah, how do you achieve the goals you want given your theory and the data and institutions? How do you do it? That's an engineering type thing. If you go back and look at Mill, he talked a lot about the art of economics. You were talking about it. There was this whole sense that is there. And economists, sort of what Neville Keynes said about it is, this is really, really messy as soon as we're talking about it. And so we have no given methodology that says this is the methodology. You use what works. What does that remind me of? An engineering methodology, which is here, you're trying to solve a problem, you do what works, and it's developed within that. And the engineers are always talking about method. So if you notice in any of your classes you haven't had any discussion of method other than you move here to this beautiful place, then you might discuss method. Engineers, what you learn are methods because the methods are tied totally to the techniques. It isn't as if method is separate. the people who are doing the techniques are saying, here, it seemed to work in this case, it didn't work so well in that case, I had to make this assumption here, I had to squeeze the edges there. And they're always talking about it. So method is totally built in to the discussion of their work and what they're talking about. The separation of method from what you're doing destroys method. Because method is involved with all the small little damn assumptions that you have to make. If only this were there, if I only had this data. I've got to use this proxy. So I'm using this proxy. Well, how much does that reduce my confidence interval? Well, engineers handle that with what they call a big fudge factor. So any engineer that you talk to will fully know what fudge factor means. Essentially, sort of you figure it out and you better be 5 times more certain than any of your models say to say, anything that they're. Why? Because you're building something and it might not work. And you're worried about whether it will work or not because it'll come back on you. Economists, notice, have separated themselves from what happens in the economy. Right. So we recently had a crash in the economy. How many of you sort of have had in your courses saying, we goofed? Any of your classes sort of emphasize that we goofed and we have to redesign and rethink it? No, if you take a look at almost all the discussion, we had the theory right, it was the administration that was wrong. It was the application that was wrong. The theory is still all good. What is that theory? How many of you learned macro theory yet? Okay. Tell me what you've learned in macro theory.
Seems like a lot of the approaches right now are just using general equilibrium methods, and I Prescott, but it seems that a lot of times, as you said, the reply that the professors will give us that the implementation of theory was not consistent with the approach.
Okay, what's the theory of macro? If you had to summarize it, you say you have somebody there sitting around. They're a very bright philosopher, and they're coming in saying, okay, what's the general theory of macro?
You take a representative agent, have some sort of preference orderings, you look at what firms do, some production technology, subtract and find the profit, maximize profit, what are the market clearing conditions?
And that tells me what about the macroeconomy?
It tells you how prices and quantities relate in different markets.
So if I'm thinking now how prices and quantities relate, I think of that. Now, what's a representative agent?
An economy, an individual or a person that you're trying to model what their preferences are. So if you're aggregating up millions of consumers, what would the average is probably not the right word to use, but what would the average consumer look like?
Okay, or the representative consumer will look like what happens if one consumer cares what the other one does? So that if one acts one way, he'll switch his actions.
There's a problem with theory.
Oh, then there's a problem. Well, does that mean I can't apply the theory then? Do individuals care about what other people do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So does that sort of mean maybe my model isn't too useful for understanding what's going on?
Just a question. So aren't there ways to deal with that, though? I totally agree that...
There are total ways. There's a whole group of people working on heterogeneous agents.
Yes.
As soon as you take a look and, I'm working with some of them on, here we can divide it up into heterogeneous agents. It's really tough to divide them up because rational expectations is really hard to specify. If you can't specify rational expectations, it's hard to sort of say what your solution concept is. Because I can sort of get a model in which everything's rational. Essentially, if I'm thinking of the economy as an engineer, damn it, I don't understand a damn thing about the macroeconomy, and there's no damn way I'm going to because it's way, way too complicated. There's too many interactions going on for me to do it. So therefore, my theory isn't going to serve much use, purpose whatsoever to try and solve problems. Now, I still might want to develop it, and I strongly supported the development, because thinking about that in a way gives you insight when people are forward-looking, how things might feed back and sort of operate. So I have no problem with work being done in that. I have an enormous problem when that's the only thing, the only approach you're allowed to take in macro. You know, macro is just too complicated. We should be taking all kinds of approaches, and if we're trying to solve problems, hell, DSGE is not going to help me try and solve the sets of problems that I'm dealing with. I'd have maybe 4 or 5 really bright people working on that. I'd have a whole bunch of people working on understanding the institutions and the incentives of the institutions, of what's operating, what's going on. I'd have another group looking at flows, aggregate flows when my models aren't moving things fast. The thing I'm looking at right now is here, you know, we have this law of one price in the international sector, and we sort of talk about it as if, you know, here, this adjustment's going to happen quickly. So globalization, really, we de-emphasize the costs and the heterogeneous aspects of the way different people get benefited by that. But it happens very, very slowly over 10 or 20 years. In the meantime, you get these enormous flows of capital that aren't fit in with our theory. Those flows of capital can sort of feed back on the way governments operate and what's happening. That's what's happening over in Europe now. Very predictable in a very simple type dirty model of here's how the system operates. Totally unpredictable from a DSGE model because it's way, way too complicated to move from that. And yet we force people to say, here, you've got to go through and work through a DSGE model. Well, why do we force people to do that? Well, in part because the key for me is incentives. And that's what ties together my talk tomorrow with my talk today. Because the reason I started looking at graduate education was because I was unhappy with the state of economics. The state of economics is what it is because people are taught to do what they do, and they're very bright people who are doing good things. But the incentives are not the incentives to find the truth, because that's what we assume the economic methodologists. They want to find the truth. No, your incentives when you're in school are to pass the test. Once you get out of school, your incentives are to publish articles. To ask the question, how does this article relate to some broad, well, that's out of my league. I'm not operating there. I'm assuming the system gets it right. Well, nobody says the system gets it right. And what I'm saying is the system has gotten it screwy, wrong. Not only in economics, but in almost all graduate education. Because what graduate education is preparing people for is not to solve problems, is not to be engineers. What graduate education is preparing people for is to be efficient journal article publishers, because that will move them ahead within the academic community. And the whole structure, the way you teach, what you learn, is all designed to fit that particular institutional structure. And when something like that happens, sort of you lose sense of what's going on. So I've offered a number of my solutions. Is you can't change the economics profession. You have to change the whole nature of, education and graduate education. Because if I were advising you what to do, and I've advised because I've written a variety of books on graduate education, students call me, what to do? Do exactly what you're doing. Sort of study, it, because here, if you don't do that, you don't succeed. You're out of the profession. So you've got to operate in that and sort of keep in the back of your mind that there's something else going on and figure out, when can I make a difference, when not. But institutions are extraordinarily hard to make a difference in. And you have to really understand that institution totally and have a group of people willing to sort of operate and work on that. But it isn't as if you are a cog there. What I'm arguing is not to not sort of do what you're doing. What I'm arguing is stop feeling really good about it. Stop feeling that here I'm out solving problems and everything else. No, I'm out creating a nice little life for me that will operate, and maybe at some time I can contribute towards some bigger problems. But that's probably the best I can hope for. And that's really the method that I'm talking about, and the message you'll get from me, is that here, operating within that, you do what you do. And study it. And I follow that from my experience within the profession. In graduate school, I was seen as a really bright kid, because in the first year I took all my qualifying exams. So, it was nice. And so there I was seen as very bright. And I decided I'd try and get through in 3 years and everything else. And, it was sort of a game for me. And so I started writing my dissertation fairly soon and was doing 3 essays on optimal taxation. Optimal taxation, this was back in the 70s, was just coming in. And so, you take a model and you tweak it. That's the nature of doing, sort of theoretical work. And so here I had, there was optimal income taxation, but it didn't have heterogeneous or different types of skills. So here I made a model where you had optimal income taxation with differential skills and could show here's how it changed. Another model I sort of showed how a regressive tax is optimal. Sort of would be there. Mainly because what it does is sort of, hits the rich people as a lump sum tax. And the rich people within the abilities model have all of the output. So you're not losing a whole lot, sort of depending. And so, sort of you can get it. And it actually can go back to 100%. You'll want to soak them to get a poll tax. And, some things you can show like that. Very nice. How relevant was to solve our tax problem or anything? Absolutely irrelevant. But, sort of it was kind of neat. I like playing around with that. So I was doing 3 essays. One I decided would be a practical essay on, sort of more the importance of administrative taxes, administrative aspects. Of course, if you have administrative costs, it undermines your whole other optimal taxation models because you assume no administrative costs. So here I could, you just tell me what result you want. I'll create a model that will arrive at whatever result you want. And a good mathematician can do that. And that was the game. And I figured here I'll learn the game and sort of go on. Then I was, sort of writing a paper one time. This was during the inflation. I wrote a paper called The Free Market Solution to Inflation. And what I said in this was sort of when, COAS was just beginning to get known in the US. So it wasn't generally, sort of known that. I said, look, inflation's not a problem. So the market can solve it. Because, of course, if we had property rights and prices, there would be no inflation. Mm-hmm. So anybody who wants to raise their price in the general equilibrium model has to pay somebody else to lower their price by an offsetting amount. And so we add another equation in it. It's a dynamic equation that goes to 0, sort of in equilibrium. In there. What would the price of raising price be if there's not accelerating inflation? Okay, what would the price of raising price be in such a model if there weren't accelerating inflation?
You mean
it would have to be 0.
Cost, right.
Because if it were in any non-zero price, it would be in someone's interest. You have excess demand. You have to get rid of the excess demand. Excess demand cannot happen. So it's a knife edge model. they can have and go. But that isn't the way it worked, actually, and sort of what we were working on was how do you get it smooth where there's costs, and it doesn't happen absolutely, immediately. In a general equilibrium model it did, but you could modify it and sort of have adjustment costs, a variety of costs to sort of have. These costs come up and get something like a Phillips curve, but it wasn't a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. It was a trade-off between the price of raising price, which is in a sense a type of price control. So by having and running it, you're running a price-controlled economy, which you can have this trade-off operating there, taking advantage of the frictions that were there. So I played with this and wrote this off and sent it off to my advisors were Vickery and Phelps. Okay? They were both interested in optimal taxation I was doing there. So I sent this off to Vickery and said, here, this little thing I was playing with. He sent me back within a week. This is the most brilliant paper I've seen, sort of in the last 20 years, So, wow, you should have seen my ego go up, and everything. I decided to dump my thesis, which I had finished 2 essays and was finishing the 3rd, and I went to him and said, if I dump that, can I finish in a year? Expanding this idea. He said, yes. You can, I think it's a great idea. And then I went to Phelps and said, Vickery said, I can finish in a year by expanding this idea. Sort of, will you sign on to it? They both signed on, so, pretty sure I'd make it through. I then spent the next year developing that idea and figuring I'd publish the paper, which if Vickery thought it was so bright, sort of everything else. Sent it into the AIER and got the absolute meanest, nastiest rejection letter that this is pure junk, absolutely meaningless, everything else going on. I said, maybe, I should shoot a little lower, sort of the normal approach that one takes. Same rejection from, sort of the next one. I said, maybe I'm in trouble. Expanding it into a thesis was hard. Luckily, at the time, I had won a fellowship that paid me for 3 years. So I decided to take longer and start reading. Start doing something. So before, I was a very, very pragmatic student who was going to graduate school because it kept me out of the Vietnam War. And, sort of here I could use, sort of play around. I wasn't interested in mathematics. It was something to do. I became interested in economics then. Interested in ideas, how they developed, where they were. It was the first chance I had to start seeing how scholars approach something, because I was no scholar. I was what you call these bad students when they come in. I was a very bright bad student. But, sort of essentially I'd figure out what's the minimum I've got to do to get the grade I want. And that's what I do. It wasn't out for learning. It was out just, sort of here is qualification. That's why I understand the incentive so well. Because most people who become academics are scholars. They're interested in it on its own. That only happened much later to me. So then I expanded this in that, and, sort of, there was no way I was going to stay in the profession. So pretty much at that point, I figured I was over and probably would have to move to management consulting. Earn lots of money, and, it wasn't so bad. But then Abba Lerner had been working on a similar idea. And he presented the paper at the AEA meetings with his paper, which was a wage inflation plan. So any firm that raised the wages of somebody had to pay another firm to lower their wages. It was with tips. There were a whole variety of things being discussed at the time. And so I went to the session that Abba Lerner was in and, sort of raised my hand at the end of it and sort of said, Mr. Lerner, very interesting, but I think you're wrong for these reasons, and sort of spelled out, sort of here were the problems that I saw in his paper. I was a graduate student at the time, and they include graduate papers, and I had one at the AEA meetings. But of course, they put it the last day of the last hour of the time when nobody's going to be around at any time. And so I was presenting there, and what happens but in walks Abba Lerner. Sort of and sits in there as I'm presenting my paper. And afterwards, he came up to me and said, I was thinking about what you said, and you may be right. Said, okay, good. So we talked some, and he said, let's work on it. And I said, when? Now. So we holed up for the next 4 days in a hotel in Chicago and sort of wrote out a whole outline for a book, and specified it. Once Abba Lerner gave me sort of an okay and we published things together, then it could be published. So now I had, enough people sort of willing to say, well, he's weird, but, he might be worth listening to and, is fairly bright. You need that to be allowed to have anything to say. But once that was there, I could stay in the profession, only on the side, not within the profession, because it's quite clear I was unwilling to play the game in the appropriate way that one wanted to. But at the same time, people could accept that I knew it. So that's how I ended up, as I did, there, and, decided where was the best place for me. Well, they offered a distinguished professorship at a liberal arts school, so when I was 35. So I decided that's not such a bad life, which gave me, a place to operate in. And that's how I ended up at Middlebury, operating, where I could do pretty much whatever I damn well pleased. Believe me, every single academic should be allowed to do whatever they damn well please. Because if you want people going out and exploring ideas, if you want them playing with things, thinking about what really works, if you have to worry, do I get published in this journal or do I do that? And I had better do this because this is the way the profession is looking at it. That does not work. And what happens is if you do it for 10 years, you're probably finished. Because you'll say, at some point I'll get out of it and do. So there's this Alan Kerman also works on a lot of this stuff with me. And he said he got a letter from a top professor at, a top school in California, who said, Kerman has all the criticisms of DSGE model he's made. And the person wrote him and said, I always knew those were true. I think you're totally right. But there's no possible way now I'm going to be able to shift and start working on it. Because here I've developed a whole set of, interrelationships of how it works, what I do, that, essentially I'd undermine completely if I did this. And so it develops where you're forced to keep it up because of all these very, very small interrelationships that are all assumed away by discussions of methodology. So it really has to do, in my view, when I'm thinking of methodology, it's a very, very incentive-oriented thing, but not general incentives, but incentives within the institutions within which we operate. And those provide enormous sets of limitations on what you can do and what you will do. That if you don't go along with them, you'll be out of the academia. And if you're out of academia, there's, no hope of changing it. So you've got to do it, but at the same time, not get fully vested in it. And it's really hard to do. And I told you my story because it was how I managed not to. I was very lucky to have not to. But it's also why most people who go into economics, I think very much thinking the same thoughts, more general thoughts, end up stop asking those. Because if you ask those bigger questions, it's really hard to do, well, this model really isn't working. And I'm not caring it, but I've got to publish it in order to, move ahead. It's hard to keep that incentive up, to work on it unless you believe in it. But the stuff that's really pushing all the boundaries is really, really tough to do. It's not there. And so that's the cointegrated vector autoregression. There are probably 5 people in the world who are doing reasonable work in that. sort of operating there. So again, that's all my sort of introduction. Now I'll talk for the next 6 hours. No, I want to quickly go through, sort of the slides that I have here, or just to go through the talk.
Let me show you the, to advance, go right, that's
Okay.
backward.
Good.
And the yellow is a pointer.
Okay. So, it really is sort of making the difference between engineers and science. Now, a scientist's goal, as I said, is to discover the truth. And science is designed. People are fast pattern completers. So that's something that psychologists have found. What they do is look at things and they figure out, here is a story that will fit there. Why is it important to be a fast pattern completer? Well, because here you see something moving over there, which might be a tiger, and it's coming up to you and about to eat you, you better say, well, I'm not sort of developing a model whether that's there. What I want to do is figure out whether, I better move or not. And people move very quickly. So they have this tendency to find patterns and believe in those patterns. And you can look at, sort of all kinds of structures, myths, scientific theories, are all patterns that people have found. Now what they found is a lot of those patterns weren't true. And science developed to separate out myth from true patterns. And science is really involved in it. I'm extraordinarily impressed by scientists who are doing it and finding it is really, really difficult to do. You develop certain, heuristics that's acceptable. Here it better be 0.99%, confidence interval. Various other things all fit before we will accept it. For whether it's scientifically true, that's reasonable to do. You can also have another aspect of scientific truth is the logic right? In other words, here I have a model, it's deductive, I'm saying it, is the logic right? That is correct or not. So that's another type of truth. And science is really about getting to that truth. The methodology of science is really about that. Almost no economists are scientists. Almost all economists are problem solvers. They're not saying, is this truth or not? They're saying, here, will this work in this particular case? What's going on? But they're using the methodology of science to try and sort of solve engineering type problems. And the way you can use that methodology is to hide all the things that don't quite fit. So here, we need a normal distribution in order to have our tests operating. Well, what do we do if we don't have a normal distribution? Well, we can develop a whole nother set of tests based upon alternative distributions. But if we do that, that takes an enormous amount of time, and then it won't fit that distribution either, because it could be a changing distribution we don't know. So then, so what you do, you'd be working still on all that. An engineer doesn't worry about any of that. An engineer doesn't care whether it's science, doesn't care whether it's true or not. An engineer cares, has it seemed to work in the past? And do I think the issue I'm looking at is sufficiently similar to what's worked in the past so I can apply it now? So it's a very matter-of-fact type thing of what's worked, a knowledge of the field that's there. So we often think of engineering as applied science. Engineering is not applied science. Engineering is quite different from science. Scientists try to understand nature. Engineers try to make things that do not exist in nature. Engineers stress invention. To embody an invention, the engineer must put his idea in concrete terms and design something that people can use. Almost all engineers working on new designs find that they do not have the needed information. So the basic thing, if you take a look here when you sort of start your micro or macro, well, we assume people have a preference set that's fully specified over the time. What if you don't? Well, people don't. An engineer would say people don't have it, so much for that model. Not especially helpful for solving it. Here, it might be useful as some background thing in thinking about it, but here I need something, what's going to work for a particular one? Here, I'll find out how people make decisions, how they choose. So you'll sort of run little tests, and you'll operate there. Most often, they are limited by insufficient scientific knowledge. Thus, they study mathematics, chemistry, physics, biology, and mechanics. Often, they have to add to it. So it isn't that this is against math at all. If you take a look at engineers, they're extraordinarily mathematical. But it's a different type of math. It's a math that's meant to solve problems. Here, I've got something, will it work now? In this particular case, well, maybe I better run a simulation. That might see whether it might work. Here, sort of here is a little model I can do, it might work. Here, I may build something. Just build it up, there. So operating. Anything that's sort of a heuristic type thing that will help give insight into it. That other engineers who are working on it agree. So within engineers, you don't have a single engineering methodology. What you have is with each branch of engineering, each element of that, you have groups of sort of people who say, this is what's worked in the past. And they convey that knowledge to other people in the techniques they've used. And that's what you learn. So it has little to do with, here's the general theoretical science that's there. It's here's what's worked. And where there's science that's useful, you use it. But you have to say, is the science that's there, is the theory that's there going to match the problem I'm trying to solve? So it's trying to solve the solver. And that's from, sort of just a straight engineering one. Definitely, an engineer is an individual who is trying to solve a problem using engineering heuristics. And they emphasize heuristics, not models. Heuristics, by its nature, say it's off the cuff. It's what works. It isn't something that I'm going to take that seriously. A scientist is an individual who is searching for the truth using scientific heuristics. So I'd argue what's developed in science is a scientific heuristic, which might or may not be good for scientists. I don't try and answer that question. It's way above my pay grade. I try and answer what people trying to solve problems are, and they're not trying to be scientists. My argument is 99.5% of economists are trying to solve problems, not trying to be scientists. So this was a paper that I gave, to methodologists saying you're wasting all your time, sort of in talking about science, because that's not what economists do. If you look on the web, Billy Von Cohn, sort of there. They have some fun stuff. Yes?
I have a little bit of things to argue about.
Okay.
The difference between engineer and scientist. I'm starting my application from engineering.
Uh-huh.
I know the path engineering. We did care about science, and actually we start everything from the science, the basic science. They need to learn the basic physics and almost a post-software physics, from the mechanics to the quantum mechanics. So we almost learn everything, but the only difference between engineering and the scientist is after, we both will start with the basic science, and then the scientist, they will go to still the very basic scientific research, but engineer will go to some questions like how to solve that. But the basic thing is, before the engineers, they know how to solve a problem, they must know what's the problem. And if they want to know what's the problem, they have to use their scientific research, or they have to use their scientific knowledge to get out the problem. So the same things with economics is the same.
So if
It's just, yeah.
okay, so if we're having somebody, sort of they're building bridges,
That's right.
clearly you better know, sort of the general science of, sort of that background. I'm not saying you don't. Do you need to know quantum theory?
Yes, we need.
Building bridges.
Yep. So quantum theory is for the electrical engineering.
Yeah, for the particular branch that you need to deal with the particular problems, I have no problem that you should have the knowledge of that theory, where it's relevant to what you're doing. I think people should know about DSGE, Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium Model. The point is, if you're trying to solve a particular problem about here's what's happening with the macroeconomy, how far off is that in the assumptions it's making from the particular type of problems that I'm dealing with? In engineering, what I'm arguing is there's a much closer connection. So in electrical engineering, you damn well better know quantum mechanics. But if you're a civil engineer working on something, well, that's really not relevant for that. You have some other things you better know.
So that's a problem right here. Your meaning is not the macroeconomics you do, like the DFG model is just far from the real world or the micro foundation of the DFG is not that good. So you say, so well, with economics, we should just to think of ourselves as engineers and just forget the micro foundation and do the macro directly. But my opinion is, I agree with you absolutely. But my opinion is the problem is the science of economics is just not that good.
I agree. But what do you do, an engineer, when the science isn't that good? Says, well, the science isn't that good, I'll go on and sort of figure out something that will work. If you're doing the science of it, you say, I've got to sort of work through this scientific model. So if I'm trying to understand what's going on, I have to sort of work through a DSG model. So you can take a look at Kehoe and Chari's paper, which I think is on sort of first-year graduate reading lists, a lot of them. What they will say is any problem in macro has to be worked through a DSG model, anything that can't, so it doesn't deserve to be called macro. That's the type sort of reaction that I'm arguing against.
So.
Not that here it might not be useful in certain things. Notice, I think my particular solution, my free market solution, came from general equilibrium theory. It was sort of thinking about it, operating there. I think it can be very useful in providing some vision to what's going on and sort of giving you senses of design, what you might do. But that's different than here I've got to now study all particular issues using this model. So I don't think we're disagreeing at all. All I'm saying is that engineers use the science that is appropriate because, and they think very much about that. But in economics, they don't think so much about that because for the most part, most engineers are paid to solve problems. Most academics are paid to write papers. And so it's a difference in the incentives that are going on. So about 20% of all engineers go into academics. It's really hard to get people to get in from engineering into academics. Probably 80% of all economists become academics. Or probably 95% is their goal that's going on. So those are the different incentives and why they operate separately. Yeah.
Well, I agree with you, but so now, so now in undergraduate, we repeat to say everything that macro is wrong, micro is totally wrong. But the problem is, now I think we have two ways to go. One way is like that, you face a problem directly and solve the problem. They do not need to go that deep into the micro foundation because that's too complicated. We can't do that. Another way to go, is just the macro. Yes, the macro theory has problem. It should be blamed, but it's not the only need to be blamed. The real problem is in the micro theory.
Agree 100%. We can talk a lot about it. We probably shouldn't, and let a couple other people. Yeah.
I would argue that economists are too much like engineers. My background's in physics, and when I think of the engineers that I work with, they take a formula sheet and blindly apply these formulas to whatever problem they're solving without any real understanding of the assumptions that go in. And I think I see that a lot in economics. I think what he was saying is econ is bad science in that they apply models that don't apply to situations.
Right.
We need to be better scientists. In physics, we always have assumptions. You have to justify your assumptions. You have to show that you have a small uncertainty.
Yeah, this gentleman went to a very good engineering school, Clemson, by the way.
So why is it your opinion that economists should be engineers rather than be better scientists and use models that use the right assumptions?
Again, it all depends on so there's many different levels of engineers. Not all engineers are sort of just here applying something like that, and not all scientists, and not all economists are. There's other engineers who are working on sort of changing it. Here's what, how it might change at times. So it's all happening, a whole variety of different levels and different layers. I'm saying just think of yourself first as trying to solve particular problems. Macro just is of importance, especially now, because our macroeconomy is in trouble. And it's in serious trouble. It has lots of flows that are going on that economists, if we go back and look earlier on, understood fairly well.
Yep.
So if I look at Badgett, or Thornton, they have better descriptions of sort of the events that are occurring than any of the latest, discussions. Yet if you look on the reading list for graduate students, you will not see any reading with that whatsoever. I'd argue Friedman had better understanding of that. Sort of going there and sort of talking about things because there was a sense of here was, the nature of what was going on. Keynes certainly did. All that stuff has been lost because as opposed to saying here's the general ideas that they were getting at, it became here's learning particular, sort of models that sort of said this is what Keynes said or this is what Friedman said. They didn't say that. They were saying something broader than that. And if you lose sight of that, that is just a heuristic that worked at a particular time. So the quantity theory of money can mean all kinds of things. And as institutions came, it can be more credit. And so what we had, the way they defined inflation, if you look at any dictionary before about 1985, inflation was defined as an increase in the money supply. Mm-hmm. And then it was noted, and by the way, prices seem to go up after that. Mm-hmm. Now what that meant is when they were talking about it, and I've been looking at classical economists, when they talked about inflation, they didn't differentiate asset inflation and goods inflation. So if asset prices were rising, that was inflation to them. We have now defined that so that isn't inflation. Well, guess what? Asset prices went way up and then you had deflation. You get asset deflation. You don't get goods price deflation. Mm-hmm. And it causes lots and lots of problems. But our models don't include it. So when we talk about here's what our goal of monetary policy is, we're not talking about things. To think about just here's the problems in sort of a general sense, you've got to do first before you can apply anything. And I'm saying that's what's sort of taken away from students in graduate school today.
That's right.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
So from what I understand from your discussion so far is that the fundamental problem lies in how the incentives are designed in the profession. Mm-hmm. So there is a race to publish instead of race to solve for multiplication. And that's the fundamental problem. I mean, whether we take the method of, it's not so much that we shouldn't be scientists or engineers. I mean, you need to understand the basic theory
Sure.
to solve the problem. But see, if we go back to, from the whatever knowledge I have, if you look at the way the nature of the firm was actually written, it was more like Coase was standing at the GM factory and observing things rather than rushing to construct a model or fit something instead of just identifying what those issues were in that specific context he was looking at. Mm-hmm. Now, is that the primary issue that you're most concerned with, the way the incentives have actually turned up and there's no real solution to it? How do you change the nature of the profession or the structure that the profession actually uses to operate?
He'll talk about that tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, let me quickly, as opposed to trying, I'll be here for the picnic, and I'd be happy.
He's staying overnight. Yes, he'll be with us overnight.
So I'd be happy to continue this discussion with lots of people. So why don't I just go through quickly there, because you're supposed to be out at 4:15?
4:30.
4:30.
Yeah.
So go through the arguments,
sooner
and then
the
we
better.
can take up a whole variety of things,
Right. Mm-hmm.
As they come along. But sort of essentially, the difference with engineering and sort of science is that what Cohn describes as the strategy for causing the best change in a poorly understood or uncertain situation with available resources. That's sort of how he defines the engineering method. And I'm arguing that that would be a much better method. Economists use models. And there's a quote from Solow sort of saying, here, that's what you do. You say, here, I have something, I got to create a model. Engineers use heuristics. And the point is, heuristic is a model that isn't taken seriously unless you have the scientific proof. So within science, the models, move to that level. But you're willing to use models when you don't have anything, whatever works for the problem. So the problem defines how precise you want to get with the model and how precise you can. The more precise, the better. But you let the problem you're trying to solve that problem, not sort of take a given methodology to begin with. So a heuristic is defined as anything that provides a plausible aid or direction in the solution of a problem, but is in the final analysis unjustified, incapable of justification, or fallible. 4 signatures of a heuristic, and these all come from Cohn. It does not guarantee a solution. Okay, it may contradict other heuristics. It reduces the search time in solving a problem. Its acceptance depends on the immediate context instead of an absolute standard. So if you notice, the methodology that I'm talking about is a muddy methodology that's learned through an apprenticeship of the people working on the problem, because they figure out how to answer all these unanswerable questions and what's worked. And then you want people thinking, well, here, I might have answered it differently, and it's constantly changing. Difference between engineering and scientific method. I'm going to go through sort of 5 of them. An engineer does whatever is necessary to arrive at a solution in the time available. And the time available is an important thing. In science, the time is infinite. So therefore, before it goes there, you'll spend whatever time because you're finding the truth. Engineering, you're solving a problem. So how much time do I have to solve the problem? And what works and what's a good model depends on how much time you have. If you notice, if I've calculated the value of the articles that, economists publish. Sort of how much does it cost to publish an article? Is it worth it? Would people say, here's how much it did to solve a problem. If you said, here, I'm interested in solving a problem, how much would I pay to solve that problem? And go back, a lot of the economic research would not be cost effective. Where it's cost effective, it gets people tenure and goes there. It is not done to really say, here's how I would, if I were having the goal of solving problems. Okay? Arriving at an answer to a question might involve back of the envelope calculations, input from other specialties, guesstimates, individual judgment, whatever is needed to provide its recommendation. In deciding how to allocate scarce time for thinking about the problem, engineering follows the weakest link principle. It allocates research resources to that part of the problem that seems to be the weakest link. So therefore, if you have to choose some general proxy, which almost always we do, and it's a lousy proxy, well, it's sort of 30, 40% off. To try and get something to a very precise level of econometric testing serves little purpose because you don't know whether the proxy is right. So if you use this weakest link principle, you wouldn't do almost all the econometric testing we're doing unless you had everything fitting it precisely. At times that might be science, at other times it might be philosophical questions having to do with goals, judgments, questions, institutional questions having to do with implementation, or historical questions having to do with how similar problems occurred in the past. Whereas a scientist is a specialist, an engineer is a generalist who brings many skills to bear on a question. So the research focus of an engineer and scientist differ. Number 2, the engineering heuristic is that since it is focused on problem solving, not truth finding, it addresses all aspects of the problem relevant to arriving at the solution, whether they are amenable to scientific treatment or not. So if someone says, well, you're not being scientific there, so what? if it's helping it. So it isn't the kiss of death to be non-scientific. To the economics, to talk about economic policy, we need to know the goals of society. What policy is presented as best depends heavily on how we specify the goals. But we're often unclear as to what the goals are. So when you're unclear about what the goals are, it's unclear, so what you really should be saying. A fundamental characteristic of an engineering solution is that it is the best available from the point of view of a scientific engineer. So notice the engineer has to say, here are my goals, here's my vision for society, what I'm thinking of. And here's why I support it. So if we look at Milton Friedman, he had a vision for society.
Yep.
He had goals that were very much part of what he was arguing. He's a wonderful engineer. If you don't buy into the goals, then you disagree with it, but that's fine. But notice we have to separate out and say it's normative. We can't talk about goals as being part of the solution. For an engineer, the goals are very much part of the solution. And we have to talk about it. We have to blend the two together. Theoretically, then, the best for an engineer is the result of manipulating a model of society's perceived reality, including additional subjective considerations known only to the engineer constructing the model. In essence, the engineer creates what he thinks an informed society should want based on his knowledge of what an uninformed society thinks it wants. This makes engineering include coming to decisions on normative issues. So it blends normative and positive in a way that just has to be there, because you've got to specify those goals in a much better way than what we've done. To say, here we want general efficiency answers nothing. A third difference involves how policy results of research are presented. In engineering, the subjective and ad hoc nature of the method is recognized, and any model used is not thought of as representing the correct model. Models are simply an aid for judgment, and you say here, I'm using judgment. That means an engineer presents his recommendations with no more certainty than one has in the weakest link of the chain of arguments needed to arrive at the proposed solution. Fourth is that allowance is made for the imperfection of knowledge, and any recommendation is accompanied by a factor, a fudge factor. These safety adjustments are determined through experience, not through scientific calculation. History is an important part of engineering, but not of science. You know what works in the past, and you make appropriate fudge factors. Cohen writes, everything the engineer does in his role as an engineer is under the control of a heuristic. Engineering has no hint of the absolute, the deterministic, the guaranteed, the true. Instead, it fairly reeks of the uncertain, the provisional, and the doubtful. The engineer instinctively recognized this and calls his ad hoc method doing the best you can with what you got, finding a seat of the pants solution or just muddling through. An economic engineer would have be much more aware of the imperfections of the model and much more honest with those imperfections with society. Find one, there's a creative part in engineering, that engineering methodology that's sort of all lost in the standard methodology. And sort of have to build that in. The next part of it really is sort of talking about the history of how it changed. What I argue is if you go back to classical economists, you had this distinction very much. They had positive economics, which was really only a very, very small part of economics. The only thing they thought they could do, they didn't think they could do any empirical testing. That was up to science. So what science was for them was logical models, making sure you had the logic of the model correct. That's what positive science was. It was pure deduction. Okay? Then you had the normative goals that were there, and most of what economists did was political economy, which was what they called it. That was the art of economics. That had no specific methodology. And Keynes said that very specifically. There's no given methodology. Use what works. And it includes many non-economic factors. You include it all. So they were discussing it. You look at Mill is the one I'm studying now. He was not an economist alone. You look at Hayek. What Hayek said, anybody who if an economist is just an economist, he probably will be a total danger to society. Because everything is interconnected, and they recognized it when talking about policy and that. And so the arguments they were making for the market were not that it was efficient. It was that here I have a vision of how society can operate. And the market, with all its imperfections, arrives at that better than other types of things I can get at. That wasn't a proof. That was a sensibility that they made the arguments for. We moved away from that, sort of as we moved towards what became known as neoclassical economics. And that was right around the time of, that Keynesian economics was coming in. Now, Keynes was a classical economist. He used a classical method. So he had a model, but it was not a scientific model. He'd switch from one model to another at various times. When you had Keynesian economics translated into models that became the textbook models, really based it on Abba Lerner's work, his economics of control. Because we were starting to sort of understand control theory at that time. And sort of here within the general equilibrium system, we can put it all in. And Lerner was the first one to have specified the general equilibrium system and the optimality of that. So you started to put it all in and sort of see, here there's right and wrong answers that you started to get. Then we started combined sort of the model with the policy. And that's the way in which Keynesian economics, and we started talking. That was totally different than existed within classical economics. And here now we start talking about models. And here the solution. Well, in order to have that, here, you have to have a controller. Well, who's the controller? And the controller's going to want to do what you tell him to do and have the ability to do that. Government doesn't fit that bill. So therefore, sort of if you take a look, classical economists were talking about how do you operate in a complex system where you're not sure who is the controller or how to control and what's operating there. A much different framework than developed. And that's all been lost. So classical economists, came to laissez-faire, but it wasn't laissez-faire, meaning here the government can do no good. They fully accepted. There's externalities, there's all kinds of reasons to do it, but here's the problems with it. And they were totally dealing with the problems simultaneously as they were dealing with the theory. As an engineer trying to say, here's what we'd actually propose would do. We moved away from that in the way we taught economics. It was really, Lerner, who did it with his economics of control, and then Paul Samuelson. Sort of took and based, took Lerner in foundations and specified it, much more carefully. And then, and this was not just Lerner, this was happening at the time. There was a movement away from sort of the Marshallian approach, which was still part of the classical approach, to a general equilibrium approach using math and that. And then the textbooks was sort of set by Samuelson, where it was this economics of control model. Because Lerner's model was so neat, and he had corrected right answers. Here's where government should enter, here's where it shouldn't. Here is, what happens. You can specify it all. All that was lost, sort of, and then people said, well, a science, there's no need to study the history of it. Because in the science, sort of the latest models incorporate all the problems of it. So we lost the history, we lost the developments, we lost all the additional dimensions that classical economists were using to arrive at their policy solutions. We think of classical economics as being sort of laissez-faire. It wasn't that at all. Sort of they had an enormous concern about government intervention. But within that, you had a wide range of views about, sort of what government should do, what it could do, what the goals of society should be. And that was sort of lost, but it was all within the same framework. Once we moved to this, what's called neoclassical, here it was, it changed the nature of the debate enormously and took out all the elements of freedom that were very important for classical economists. Those were sort of lost because they didn't fit within the model itself. ISLM, sort of became Keynes. That's not a description of what Keynes was saying, because that says, here, it's controllable. Keynes was talking about a problem within classical economics, that they really did not deal with full employment. What would happen in the feedback mechanisms that would happen in the aggregate economy. Keynes said, you got to deal with these. How do you deal with them? Well, he didn't know exactly. He sort of played with a multiplier model. He played with lots of different models. But he based his policy on, sort of what worked for a particular time. So there's a famous joke about Keynes, sort of that he came to 5 policy solutions every afternoon. Yeah. Because what he'd do is try and deal with the problem with his knowledge of institutions, which was very good. But he blended the two together. Lerner came with very precise ones. Here, sort of you had functional finance. Here's where you should run what policy when. And government should do it. The big difference was, of course, on deficits. In functional finance, deficits don't matter. So you can run infinite number of deficits and debt. Within sort of a practical problem, Keynes was very much against it. So when Lerner made this argument at the Fed, Keynes got up and said, you don't know what you're talking about. Keynes was very much anti-deficits. Not because he didn't think at times deficits could be helpful, but because there were other problems with deficits that he brought in. All those dimensions have been lost. Laissez-faire was not a no government intervention policy. It was really sort of a sense that here is a heuristic. When government enters in, there's lots of additional problems that often develop. And if you're going to advise that government enter in, you better be fully aware that these are going to develop and figure out ways to deal with them. That's something, that a lot of people could agree with, and then you could start debating it. A change in the use of models occurred when we moved from classical to neoclassical, and then DSGE, I considered ISLM models almost useless. DSGE models were a definite improvement. I saw them as because they got the logic right. Sort of operating under the assumptions they were made. Unfortunately, the assumptions they made had to be so restrictive that the models weren't especially useful for talking about the type of practical problems I want to talk about. But that doesn't mean that, so they weren't useful, sort of for general vision. Then it was, how do you deal with it? And, sort of that we can talk about after. And the stuff I favor is really complexity models. And sort of the group of people I work with is within complexity science. That it says essentially the system is too complex to even have a theory of it. So therefore what you have to do is sort of operate and develop partial theories that fit in particular places. So we accept that we cannot have a useful general theory and then have a whole variety of submodels that go on. Sort of here the problem with DSGE models was that here you had to assume, all kinds of nonlinearities away. And here I have some just discussions that really nonlinear dynamic systems, what you find is they can jump suddenly from one thing to another. They can operate there. So we better know what situations are likely to be in those type jump situations. Trying to figure it. You want sort of people to be taught in all those, but what you're learning is, of course, here is the standard model, which is really, really tough. These other ones are a lot tougher, and then they say, oh, you're supposed to talk about monetary and fiscal policy. So the science of macro, I argue, should be working a lot on nonlinear dynamical systems. That's where I put the resources going in, because I think that's the particular part of science that is most likely to be relevant to macro. that we haven't done, and would not be sort of extending, sort of a DSGE model with a representative agent to 2, 3, or something. So 3 implications: to be useful, any model needs to come with a set of user instructions to make meaningful conclusions about the model's usefulness. That we don't provide, we teach you models, but we don't talk about the user instructions. Classical economic policy, I think, has been seriously misunderstood. Keynesian economic policy, I think, has been seriously misunderstood. They're much closer together than what we talk about, and we need students to be trained in designing and thinking about those sets of instructions as well as the technical modeling. So, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.